On today's emergency podcast, Trae Young is going to be out for at least 4 weeks as a result of a finger injury. We'll get into all of what sort of led to this, how the fallout could affect the Hawks, the details, and much more, and all of that is on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1660 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening for an emergency podcast. Not scheduled. I will have a podcast after this one. The Hawks take on the Orlando Magic just very shortly after this, but it was a big enough news event that I'm going to dive in now and give you an emergency podcast before tip-off. Hopefully it'll be available as soon as possible on YouTube especially. We're still waiting on the audio-only feeds to upgrade and be replaced, and they'll be up by Monday. But anyway, all that to decide. If you're a new listener, welcome aboard. If you're a recurring listener, thank you for being here. And please subscribe to this podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, etc. But the news of the day is Trae Young is going to be out for quite some time with a left pinky finger injury. We'll over the podcast talking about kind of the specifics on the injury. And at the end of the podcast, I'll sort of answer your questions about kind of how things might unfold from here. The schedule, draft implications, the Hawks, the tanking question that I keep getting quite some time now. And we'll get into all of that on hopefully what is going to be a whirlwind podcast and obviously big news on this Sunday. So Trae suffered the left finger injury during Friday's loss to Toronto. I noted that on the post-game podcast, episode 1569, that you can listen to on this same podcast feed. Also on Twitter, it was covered on the TV broadcast extensively as well. So it wasn't like this was coming out of nowhere. This is definitely a known injury. It was seen with his fingers taped together in the second half of the game on Friday. Then the Hawks initially listed Trae as questionable on Saturday evening for Sunday's game. About 2 hours later, though, the Hawks downgraded him to out, which is not usually what the Hawks would do. Usually they don't update the injury report on the same day before, unless it's sort of an addition. A downgrade is, it's not unprecedented, but certainly is rare. So my antenna was up in a big way. Some alarm bells there from me. I did some digging on the potential of the broken finger, etc., etc. But this particular diagnosis that broke on Sunday was not the one that I was thinking by any means. And I'm not an injury expert. I'll say that right now. But Trae had an MRI, and it showed, quote, a tear of the radial collateral ligament, which is the RCL, in the fifth finger, which is the pinky finger, of his left hand, end quote. He's actually going to have surgery on this finger to repair that ligament on Tuesday at the hospital for special surgery up in New York. And the timeline is interesting here. So reevaluation is going to be approximately 4 weeks from now. Again, I want to stress, and I say it all the time, but I think it's very, very important to kind of stress on this particular instance. Reevaluation is not the same thing as return. So if you see a headline that says Trae Young's going to be out for 4 weeks, that's not necessarily true. He is going to be reevaluated in 4 weeks. That would be about March 24th, as I'm recording this podcast on Sunday, February 25th. If you include the Orlando game later tonight, that's 14 games that he would miss if it was exactly 4 weeks. And again, I doubt that it would be exactly 4 weeks, but usually, not always, but usually, a player is not coming back exactly at the 4 week mark when he is evaluated in 4 weeks. So keep that in mind. I would say just casually, I would sort of refer to this as at least 4 weeks. But reevaluation, crucially, does not mean return at this point in time. So as for the timeline itself, moving forward, first and foremost, everyone's going to be guessing here, even on the inside, but especially on the outside. The Hawks are almost never going to give you like the return timeline in general. Organizationally, they give you the reevaluation timeline for anything longer than a day or two. They're going to give you that rather than projecting a return, at least for public consumption. So part of that is that there's flexibility there. It doesn't really nail them down, but it also is part of it because you never know exactly what a player is going to be returning. And they're kind of, at least they've determined, it seems like, that they're better off being a little bit vague on this than being wrong on a stated return timeline. But anyway, Jeff Stotts, who is a very noted injury expert, he runs the blog In Street Clothes, talked about how this is kind of a very uncommon injury. He said that the RCL injury that Trae is having here is, quote, functionally limiting, and how it made more sense in his mind to go ahead and act right now rather than actually put it off till the offseason. This is not a reporting by me. This is a guess at this point. But because it's this non-shooting hand, maybe there was a chance if it was like the NBA Finals or something like that, that Trae could have played. because, it's not like, he could still shoot jump shots, etc. But as Stotts emphasized, I think I would do the same. It would limit Trae Young. Trae is based as he's a skill player. He's a small guy. He needs all of his skills and dribbling with the left hand, passing with the left hand, finishing with the left hand, all that stuff. Players don't have surgery for no reason. So essentially, it's obviously a very clear and specific and significant injury to the point where it's going to take surgery to repair it. And there would be fear of long-term damage, is what I have been hearing behind the scenes in the last couple of hours, if he did not have this fixed. So there's not really any debate here. He have it done. It is what it is. The injury happened. And by the way, as kind of a sidebar here, I get some of it's probably just jokes, but way too many people that I have seen were throwing around how it's so convenient for the Hawks or whatever. But I mean, the injury happened on live television. We all saw it. And again, you don't have surgery in New York and fly there and all that stuff for a long recovery period for no reason. So obviously it's a real injury. So anyway, the most optimistic scenario imaginable would have Trae missing more than half of the games remaining for the Hawks. 14 is exactly how many he would miss if he was out for 4 weeks out of the 26 remaining for Atlanta. Several people have asked me this question. Could he be out for the rest of the season? And the answer is yes. He certainly could, I want to stress, could be out for the season. That does not mean he's going to be out for the regular season, but the regular season finale, as I'm recording this podcast, their final game, Game 82, is 7 weeks from today. And Trae's going to be reevaluated in 4 weeks. If you do the math on that logic, there's definitely a chance that he would not come back. For one, he might not be ready to come back. That's kind of just logical. In reading some past stuff from Jeff Stotts, information, timelines from players, teams in the past, players with RCL injuries in their non-shooting hand somewhere, the projections initially are something like a return to basketball activities, which is not necessarily games, in 6 to 8 weeks at times, at least in that neighborhood. Obviously, there's 7 weeks left, so 8 weeks is beyond the end of the regular season. 6 weeks, again, be optimistic, and that is a little bit close to the end of the season. So even if you just assume that Trae was going to come back no matter what, as soon as he possibly could, he still might not be able to return. So keep that in mind. Again, some guessing here, some reporting, some information, and again, we're all kind of educated guessing here, but could he be out for the season? Absolutely. Then you have the reality that the Hawks could be out of the playoff race by then. This will come back up in a second later on in the show, but if the Hawks really struggle here, which is possible, they could be outside the play-in mix by the time Trae is reevaluated even, much less when he could actually come back. I'm not projecting that necessarily, but it's definitely possible. Let's say they're the 11 seed or the 12 seed in the East at that point. Is there a reason to bring him back? Maybe not. And that would be logical in some respects. But again, I'm not the one making the choice. It's always up to the doctors and the players and the coaches and all that stuff. It's an organizational decision, especially with the best player on the team in Trae Young. A lot of voices in the room on this one, the training staff, number one among them, and of course Trae. So a lot of ifs that are not going to be able to be answered for several weeks. So we're all kind of projecting at this point in time. That is the details as we know them right now, and the breakdown of all of that. I'll have more of my opinion and the analysis about the on-court stuff and where they go from here in a second. But there you go on that. I'll actually answer some questions on sort of mini mailbag form momentarily. But first, a word from our sponsors on the podcast today. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly. I host and produce this podcast by myself, and that requires sending a ton of different emails and making a ton of notes in preparation for the podcast. No matter what kind of work you do, how you communicate is key in your workplace, and all of those emails or notes or reports are important to the collaboration that you actually need to have to get things done, and Grammarly can help with all of that. Grammarly is your AI writing partner and helps you communicate more effectively and efficiently in order to make the bigger impact that you're looking for at your place of work. When I communicate with different supervisor managers in the sports writing space, I've also used Grammarly to help me work efficiently and confidently. It saves time. It also helps with clarity to get things done the way that you want to. And better writing means a stronger impact in your workplace. 96% of people that use Grammarly report that Grammarly helps them craft more impactful writing. And Grammarly also works across 500,000 apps and websites. And by understanding your writing in context, they provide relevant, personalized suggestions. Make a bigger impact at work with Grammarly. Sign up right now and download for free at Grammarly.com/podcast. That is Grammarly.com/podcast. One more time, Grammarly.com/podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Stitch Fix. With Stitch Fix, you get a stylist who understands your style, your size, and your budget, and they do all the shopping for you, which makes it the easiest possible way to update your wardrobe this season. With Stitch Fix, I give my stylist my size and budget preferences and my style preferences as well. Then I order boxes when I want to and how I want to with no subscription required. And then they send me 5 just for me pieces plus outfit recommendations and pro styling advice. I keep what works for me and send the rest back to them. My stylist is also looking to send just right pieces and the fit is always on point, and they make it also very easy for you at Stitch Fix. I don't like to shop, and they save me a ton of time and effort and not having to do that, honestly. And plus, I get the outfits that I really think make me look good and feel really good as well. If you don't love something, just send it back to Stitch Fix, and they have shipping, returns, and exchanges, and they're always free at Stitch Fix. They give you a style that makes you feel as good as you look, and you can get started today at stitchfix.com/lockedon. That is stitchfix.com/lockedon. One more time, the place to go is stitchfix.com/lockedon. All right, some nuts and bolts questions first, and then we'll dive into kind of the biggest picture one about the future and all of that. People asked about the hardship exception. Basically, there's a rule in the NBA, if you have a bunch of injuries, you can apply for the hardship and be able to add a player without having to actually have a roster spot available. The Hawks do not qualify right now. You have to have at least 4 guys out for at least 3 games with a expectation of missing even more time, and right now they only have 3 guys that qualify. Trae will be out soon enough, long enough, along with Okongwu and Gay, but everybody else is not injured. They're in the G League or whatever, so they don't qualify for that just now. That's just something to keep in mind. And yes, the Hawks still have a full roster. The Trent Force situation remains unsolved. If you want more on that, I wrote about it at patreon.com/BT Rowland recently. I've been ranting about this for a while, but essentially Trent is ineligible to play, and that's been a whole different saga in recent days. People ask about the schedule. The Hawks have a interesting game coming up tonight as I'm recording this podcast, so I won't do any analysis on that on this show. But then they have a coin flip game or so on Tuesday at home against Utah. They'll be the underdog, though, in the next 4 games after that. They play 3 games on the road in New York, 1 against the Knicks and then 2 against Brooklyn. Not huge underdogs there, but certainly on the road without Trae and Onyeka. Tough sledding. And then they also have a 5-game West Coast trip looming at the end of March. That's going to be pretty tough no matter what. That's hard for any team. Then you throw in the Hawks are shorthanded, and that'll be a little bit of an uphill battle. Schedule-wise, it's not a disaster at all, but the Hawks have been losing some games recently that they probably should win, and obviously every game is its own animal, but it's not super easy nor super hard. Then there's the draft question. Yes, the Hawks have their own pick this year. If season ended today, they had the 9th best lottery odds. If you asked me to guess where they would be entering the lottery at the end of the season right now, only with what I know at this very moment, I would say probably in a similar spot to where they are right now. That would be somewhere in that 10-11 range in the Eastern Conference, and that means the 9th best lottery odds. They could get to something like 6, 7, 8 if they really, really had a downturn the rest of the season. But that's kind of where we are right now. There's basically no way for the Hawks to get into the top 5 pre-lottery because the teams at the bottom are awful and they have a lot of losses, etc. Also, the Hawks have the Kings pick in the mix. The Hawks might have that pick. The Kings have to make the top 8 playoffs in the Western Conference. That could happen, but it's not a lock by any means. They're in there now, but a lot of the projection systems like ESPN's BPI, etc., had that as kind of a coin flip right now because the play-in teams in the West, like the Lakers and the Warriors, are pretty tough, and the Kings are ahead of them right now, but you have to get out of the play-in too. So TBD on that, but the Hawks could have 2 picks in the top 20. We will see. And then the big question that everybody keeps asking, sort of the impact. Should the Hawks tank? Will they tank? How will they approach this? I'm kind of going to bring all those questions into one right now because I got like 30, 40 questions about this right away, and I get why. It's obviously a huge looming thing right now. As far as whether they will tank, quote unquote, or not, I can't answer that right now. Everyone around the team is obviously reeling from this because, as I've been saying for a while, this has been a group focused on winning for quite some time. They're not really trying to entertain the thought of prioritizing draft position or anything like that. You can see the way that they've actually used the rotation this year, that they have been trying to win. Even at the expense of young guys sometimes, which I have not loved, but I'm talking about just the organizational point of view. They're obviously trying to win every night so far this year. Could that change? It could. I don't think it's going to be a full-blown tank, though, for several reasons. First, it's kind of hard to tank in the way that people are talking about it now when you have 6 of their top 8 guys still healthy. Yeah, obviously, without Trae and Okongwu, if you remove those guys from the roster and don't replace them, as the Hawks are right now, they're not going to be very good in a big picture sense. That's pretty obvious to me, but anyway, they're still not horrible as they are constructed right now, obviously. They'll still win some games. Plus, as I type this is actually a very, very important thing as I'm reading this to you. In February 25th, right now, the Hawks are 9 games ahead of the Blazers. They're 10 games ahead of the Hornets. They're 13.5 games ahead of the Spurs, 15 games ahead of the Wizards, and 16 games ahead of the Pistons. So even if the Hawks literally lost every game the rest of the year, which they're not going to do, they still probably would not get into the top 3 or 4 of the lottery. So I've seen a lot of people like recently in the last couple of hours, I'm sure some of it's tongue in cheek, talking about like being in the top 5 of the lottery odds or top 5 picks or taking for Alex Sarr or taking for Ricochet or whatever, they're going to need some luck in the lottery to have any chance of that, because they're not going to be entering the lottery in the top 5. Even with all this stuff in hand, even if they tried to tank the rest of the season, they won't be there. So the more interesting thing is that the Hawks currently have a 10 seed, right? They are 3 games ahead of Brooklyn and 3.5 ahead of Toronto as I'm recording this podcast on Sunday. I said it before that I thought coming into now, basically, that the Hawks were likely to make the play-in unless something bad happened. And obviously, Trae going down for several weeks qualifies as something bad happening. But part of why I said that, in addition to the Hawks, is that they have a comfortable lead right now, and the Raptors and the Nets are just not very good. Now, on the other hand, they're not like super incentivized to not be very good because they don't have their own picks necessarily. Toronto has potentially the ability to keep control of their own pick, but Brooklyn does not. Again, neither is terribly impressive. Even a 3 or 4 game lead this late in the season is pretty significant. It's not like impossible to give away, as the Hawks might do in the coming days, but that's a real lead they have on Toronto and Brooklyn. The Hawks can fall below those teams, but again, that's more of a discussion than it is to like kind of get the mythical pursuit of a top 5 lottery odds situation. They could fall out of the play-in for sure. That's not impossible. That might even be likely if you want to be pessimistic about not having Trae right now. But anyway, there's the other part of the question about where they should tank. I think the Hawks are not quite there yet and don't really need to be. But I will say this. If it was me, I would prioritize the future more than the present. Now, what does that mean? I think the clear way to do that is to make it a point to play young guys, and especially Kobe Buffkin, a lot the rest of the season. Make him the backup point guard behind DeJounte, and also play him some with DeJounte. I'd start doing that basically now. If it was me, I'm not saying it has to happen tonight as I'm recording this podcast, but the rest of the year, my plan, at least as long as Trae is out, would be to play Kobe Buffkin 25 minutes a game. Whenever DJ's off the floor, backup point guard, and have them play a little bit together. That's hopefully the role that you want him to be in long term as a real contributor. And he might struggle. He's a rookie guard. It might happen. But again, prioritizing the future over the present. The rest of the guys that are young, AJ Griffin, Seth Lundy, a little bit more nuance there. Griffin looked pretty good on Saturday in the G League, but they might reasonably believe that he needs some more reps at the College Park level because he's not played a lot of basketball. That's fine with me. That wouldn't bother me a lot. I think pretty soon, by the end of the year, you want to see what he's going to be able to be capable of doing in the NBA, but TBD on that. Lundy, obviously a little bit older guy, not as urgent, second round pick, but I'd be fine looking at him as well. I think he could be on an NBA court right now and would look totally fine. So it's also brutal that Okongwu's out right now because obviously it would be pretty intuitive to play him a lot because he's a young guy. They have him cost control long term on an extension. Hopefully he'll come back and be able to do that at some point. Because on top of everything else, Capella is, of course, not a long-term guy on the roster. Also, he and Murray have never fit very well together. Capella plays much better with Trae than with DeJounte. So they have to play Capella. They don't have bodies. Like, I've ranted about this before, but right now they have 2 centers and 3 forwards on the whole roster. So you can't just not play any of those guys. He has to play. So does Bruno. That's just where they are. Hopefully the Hawks might go out and get someone to rectify the Trent Ford situation and maybe bring in another big. But it won't be an exciting player. It's going to be a long-term development guy or a plug-and-play depth piece. But no matter what, I think prioritizing, the simplest way I put this again, is to focus on the future more than the present. Maybe stuff like resting Bogey on back-to-backs to kind of make sure that he's not overextending himself. Capella, same thing. If they had another center, they could maybe have Clint sit back-to-backs and not play a ton of minutes and all that stuff. That's probably wise short-term and long-term, to be honest with you. But we'll see what happens there. But no matter what anybody tells you right now, we do not know either way if Trae Young will be back this season or where the Hawks will be in the standings when he comes back. We don't know. We might have guesses. We don't know. I made it a point to, even before the injury, I would personally care a lot more about the future than the 9 or 10 seed this year. I've been saying that for weeks now. It's even more the case now with Trae out. And a realistic projection is that the Hawks are probably not going to be as good without Trae as they are with him. While I know there are some people, and I think it's probably grown a little bit. I think his approval rating is lower than it's been locally. I kind of just dismiss out of hand that the Hawks would be better without Trae. That's a very silly thing, I should say. Could it happen in 1 game sample sizes? Sure. Could they win tonight? Could they win Tuesday? Sure, they could. They're not going to be awful, I don't think. But they're not better without Trae. Just by the way, the last 12 games without Trae, going back to the last 2 seasons, they're 3-9. You know, that's not a significant sample size. I'd probably say they're going to be better than that over the course of a full season if that were to be the case. But right now, they're 24-32 as I record this podcast. I would bet that they are worse than that without Trae. We'll see. And the last thing, by the way, before I get out of here is that I won't be too cloudy on this. I'm trying not to be too negative, but it's been a pretty brutal season for the Hawks. I know Hawks fans know that, especially the ones that listen to this podcast and watch the podcast, and I do really appreciate all the support. It's been a frustrating, maddening, bizarre, not terribly fun season if you are a Hawks fan right now, and I get all that. This is not going to make it any better. I get that. Potentially, and look, I don't blame anybody for looking ahead toward the draft at this point in time. That's just the nature of fandom. You're not on the team. You don't have to focus on the upcoming stuff. But all that said, this news isn't going to make it any better. I understand the angst I've seen since the news broke. The Hawks are not in the greatest place. You don't want to be in the 10 seed no matter what, and then you don't want to be the 10 seed and then you lose your best player for several weeks. You already are down your most exciting long-term center, et cetera, et cetera. So no matter what, that's kind of where we are. I did a good job, at least a thorough job, I would say, hopefully, of going through all the questions. If you have more of them, I will answer them moving forward. I'm planning on doing a podcast after the game tonight as I'm recording this podcast between the Hawks and the Magic. I'll have more on that podcast. I'll have more later on this week. So I know some podcasts might kind of go in and out. I am always here. I will be here to cover the stretch run as I always would. I'll give the info that I have all the time as this stretch unfolds without him and without Trae and his impact. And as we find out more and more about how the Hawks might handle the rest of the season, I'll have all of that for you. I'll set off now for the actual game starts between the Hawks and the Magic on this Sunday. But please do me a favor if you have not already and subscribe to this podcast. Check us out on YouTube if you want the immediate stuff right now. By the time you listen to this podcast, hopefully on Monday, some of us, at least anyway, my audio only feeds will be back up and running. That was a network change over the weekend, but hopefully that'll be rectified by midday on Monday. But check us out and subscribe. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, definitely YouTube, etc. Also follow us on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there as well at BT Rowland. I also write about the Hawks, including a little bit of writing about Okongwu this weekend and about Trae this weekend at patreon.com/BT Rowland. Your patronage there would be awesome as well. Thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Hopefully this was kind of coherent as I'm trying to get it in before tip-off on this Sunday evening. Stay tuned, and we'll see you all next time.